We are slowly moving to our final session of today. It was a long day, and I'm really glad that you guys stick with us. This is personally one of the sessions I was looking forward the most, which is the panel section on machine learning and forest. So I'd like to welcome the panelists, Janina, Sam, Max, and Simeon, to join the panel.
Sure.
Hi, yeah.
Don't know what to say.
So I think we're ready. Let's start the session.
Yeah, let's do it.
Sure.
So I would like to start asking some questions which we prepared for the first couple of minutes, and then open up the session for the panel, for the audience to also ask questions. I see a lot of questions have already been upcoming in the chat, and we've been like noting them. So don't worry. So first of all, the very first question is a personal one, which is, how did you end up working in a field such as like this? So the question is really like the motivation behind your work, and a little bit about your background, and how did you end up here? So Max, I know that you graduated with a CS degree actually from Yale University. Yep. So it would be great to give us some motivation about your background anyway.
Yeah, sure. So when I went to school, I thought I was going to be pre-med along with everybody else. And, you know, the thing that got me into it was, well, you know, first of all, was organic chemistry. And then second of all, you know, once I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life, now that I was no longer pre-med, I was looking for a field that I thought, you know, had a relatively low level of quantitative sophistication and had a potentially enormous scale impact. And that leads you pretty quickly to forestry. Yale sort of randomly has the oldest school of forestry in the country, actually, founded by Gifford Pinchot, who created the U.S. Forest Service. But met my co-founder there, and you know, for me, I actually would not say that I have a particularly profound environmental ethic, actually, generally. But what I hate is waste and inefficiency. And what was so exciting for me is that, you know, in the realm of natural resources and how we manage forests and stuff, there was just such opportunity to use data to do better and make better decisions for whatever values you had, even if it was just optimizing your timber revenue, you know. But, you know, what's exciting for me now is the ability to use this data to address what truly are market failures in the realm of all these ecosystem services. You know, there's a $10 billion a year market for the timber harvest in the US, but that works because it's really easy to measure and pay for value. When you cut down a tree, you put it on a logging truck and you drive it to a mill, they literally weigh it and you get paid by the ton. But for all these other things like carbon and wildlife habitat and fire risk and water quality, all this stuff that actually happens out in the woods where it's traditionally been really difficult to measure and pay for value, there's been enormous market failure. And so, you know, for me, that, you know, one of the key things we can do to take climate action is, well, if we want more of these climate outcomes, let's pay people for them, and let's have a measurement and measurement data-driven market mechanism to do so. And so that's what's really exciting to me.
Interesting. Janina and Sam, we know that you're social scientists, as self-described social scientists, but working heavily on the machine learning side too nowadays. So how did it start that you guys were focusing on deforestation in Brazil and in Indonesia, and what were your motivations behind using data for analyzing it?
So from my side, I really come from a political science background. I did political science in undergrad, and then moved into environmental policy analysis and agricultural policy analysis, because I wanted to understand better how agriculture could be done and could be incentivized that was sustainable both on an environmental and a social side. And this still influences a lot of the research questions that we ask. This is also why in our work now we ask not only about the effectiveness of these policies, but also the social equity and the impacts on different types of producers. I wrote my PhD thesis on coffee, actually, and certifications in the coffee space. So I started having quite a fascination with commodities and the way in which their they're produced by very small producers around the world oftentimes, but then are aggregated and sort of increase in value at the consumer end. I have to say that, again, my foray into machine learning and big data is still at its beginning now in this group, and it's really exciting to learn more on how to harness both the quantitative and the qualitative insights. I think that that's always a benefit, to allow for the data that we have to be used the best, but also to complement it with things that we wouldn't be able to know, for instance, just by satellite data, right? So to bring the two worlds together is sort of a passion project, and I look forward to seeing how that develops. Sam?
Well, from my perspective, my background is actually as an anthropologist, and I did my master's working with an indigenous community that were within a palm oil concession in Indonesia. So that really got me interested in commodities and landscapes and the intersection between people and the environment. And I basically just followed the questions, and that's led me to increasingly large data sets, as I think is true of a lot of people. Personally, I'm from London, but my father's a forester, and I guess I wanted to follow in his footsteps, but not too closely. So he studies forests, and I study places where forests once were.
Fascinating. So Simeon, I know that you've been spending a lot of time on the field as a forest. So you graduated with a forest management degree, but now you're heavily involved with digital solutions, as you presented. So what's your background? How did that came to be?
Yeah, thanks. So actually, I was also about to study medicine after high school, and somehow redecided. I spent a year in the Philippines instead, working in an indigenous tree nursery, and I was living in this tiny village on the Pacific coast. And we had 2 tsunami warnings during that time, and a lot of the trees that we actually planted died due to reasons that I couldn't really identify at that time. And I realized that how fragile the connection between these communities are with the environment where they're living. So permanent fear of tsunamis and storms, and not really knowing how to make your living. And so I went to study forestry, got a degree, and started working with a German-based NGO on forest restoration in Indonesia and Uganda. And the focus of both of these projects was to improve the livelihoods of local people. So the main focus was really generating a sustainable income from timber plantations and agroforestry. And at the same time, trying to maximize biodiversity as good as possible. And in that case, I realized that forestry, and my professor repeated that phrase so often, forestry is not about trees, forestry is about people. So you really have to satisfy the needs of the local communities in order to make a successful restoration work. And so I always focused on the economic component of restoration, and I wanted to develop scalable solutions. And you mentioned this Google Impact Challenge Award that we won for the smartphone idea to generate large-scale data. And I think I'm really fascinated by that idea with such a simple tool to add benefits for everybody that's somehow involved in land management.
Oh, wonderful. So Simeon, you are the environmental impact officer at your research lab, which is a very unusual role, I would say. How would you define your role? Is that what is environmental impact for your lab and for you personally?
Yeah, it's actually, I don't know of any other research group that has an impact team, and we're just starting to build this team to actually take our science to the ground. And I mean, the goal of our research group is to understand and address climate change in the space of global ecosystem ecology. So you're working on the restoration of ecosystems that's so tightly connected to the huge environmental challenges that we're facing today, it's clear that you cannot stay in your scientific academic ivory tower, but you have to give out your knowledge and engage with the ones that are out there to use your knowledge for the best. So we're currently in the phase to conceptualize our solution, to better understand what the practitioners out there actually need, and based on that knowledge, build our platform, like define the data layers, the information that restoration practitioners need, and the functions that this platform should contain.
Max, your CS background, how would you say influenced this on your decision making on running SilviaTerra and working with foresters?
Yeah, I think what's been most interesting to me is that the amount of time that I've really had to use my computer science training over the last 10 years in this has probably been about 3 months. And most of the challenge of doing this type of change is understanding people's incentives, and it's really a people and societal structures challenge, and understanding like what causes people to make the land management decisions that they do, and a lot of that is driven by economic incentives, by policy incentives that may or may not be completely screwed up, and understanding how to work within those to achieve the impact that you're trying to achieve, or that other people want to achieve. And to me, that's been the most interesting part. For me, I did computer science just because I love building stuff and understanding how things work. And to me, it's been both fascinating and really frustrating to see, how forestry works in the real world. And we're a little unusual on this call because we're a private company. I mean, we started at Yale. But we've basically been bootstrapping this company the whole time. And what's really interesting about doing this with a company as the vehicle is that it forces you to maintain the discipline of like solving real problems and making things like really work out in the real world all the time. And it's been like getting punched in the face every day for 10 years, which has been really painful, but it also has forced us to do things that create real value for real people out in the real world. And I mean, it's been tough. And the computer science side of it's just, understanding how all these components fit together to, result in a system that somehow still doesn't result in toilet paper in my local Walmart. But, hopefully that is a temporary shortage situation. So, yeah, so that's me.
Thank you so much, Janina and Sam. So let's stick on this question on policy and real world impact. How do you communicate your research findings, your policy to decision makers, and what are common pitfalls when you do so?
That's a great question. I mean, it's always great to communicate as directly as possible with the practitioners that we do study, right? Because they are the ones that are actually implementing the policy, and many times they're also quite interested in having external eyes on what they do, what they might be doing better. This is not always the case, especially if you're talking to large corporations, because you want to be talking not to the comms person, the communications team, but actually to the people on the ground, right, and actually getting their ears. So there's a lot of trust building involved, I would say, and it tends to be part of a longer term process where they become our research subjects at the beginning. We interview them. Many of them will ask for research findings once we have them. Another challenge, I guess, is the time lag between academic outputs and the corporate timelines that are often involved. So I'll have to tell people, well, I'll get back to you in a year or two once we actually have, analyzed all of this and made sure it's scientifically sound. Many times they wish for more immediate results, and thus they would hire consultancies rather than working with academics. But yeah, I mean, we try to always accompany the outputs that we have by a policy brief and communicate that through a number of platforms to also make sure that whatever question we ask remains relevant to practitioners.
Yeah, and just to add, as well as companies, we also work closely with government. So like we have a long collaboration with the Brazilian Agricultural Research Agency in Brapa, and with NGO practitioners such as Trace, who I showed work that we do with them, and other groups that are working directly with companies and also with governments themselves.
Great. So what are some of the main reasons that forests are managed unsustainably? Maybe Sam, Janina, and also Max. What do you like? We talked a lot about digital tools of detecting those drivers, for example, for deforestation. But I think one of the really interesting things for the audience to understand is what are the human drivers? What is like? Why would someone manage his forest unsustainably?
Mm-hmm. Do you want to start, Sam?
Sure. In terms of why someone would manage their forest unsustainably, when we're talking about frontier regions where Janina and I work, there's very little money that can currently be made from conserving forest, which is an unfortunate reality. But so primarily the people I work with, cattle farmers, they are probably the least efficient people on the planet in terms of return per hectare. In the Brazilian Amazon, we're talking like 1.5 cows a hectare is a really, really good stocking rate. That's someone doing all the right things. And that return is minuscule when you compare the amount of carbon, biodiversity, and all the other benefits that rainforest could give. But there simply are very few pathways to getting funds right now.
Yeah, as an addition, and again, it always depends a bit on context. So in Indonesia, I focus both on large-scale companies that own concessions as well as communities that held customary land rights to forests. And so those here, the drivers are a bit different. From the company level, again, they have acquired this land and see this as an investment opportunity. And so any land that is not transformed into agriculture will be seen as a stranded asset, basically, unless they can get some sort of alternative return from them. There are companies that do now recognize their responsibilities and preserve forest that is of particularly high conservation value on their concessions they have. But depending on the legal context, that might also be difficult if it's already been zoned as an agricultural land. Sometimes the Indonesian government, for instance, may force the company to transform it all or else take the land back because they say that this particular oil palm company is not a conservation agent. So why are they maintaining forests on that land that was supposed to be contributing to the national income, right? And so here again, we see these development versus conservation complexities play out. And this is the same in the case sometimes of forest dwelling communities. They have been caught between a rock and a hard place a lot of the times as more companies have encroached on land that used to be theirs. They, in the past, have given it up quite easily because they thought that basically the forest was endless. And now that they're noticing that there's less and less land for them, they're concerned about where will we plant our crops? How will we gain our income? There's not enough jobs that are off farm. And so the forest becomes an ideal asset for them to convert to actually attain their livelihoods. And it's also a bit of a race because once people have converted it, it's no longer, then it's kind of belongs to them, right? So it requires a lot of collective action to preserve a forest as a whole, which also happens, but it's a bit more complex.
Yeah, so on my end, I'm a bit of a cynic. I think that, you know, what changes how land gets managed are the economic incentives. And, you know, I think Sam pointed out, you know, it's like, well, if you're not making any money keeping a forest as forest and you're making, you know, even like, you know, marginal money converting it to cattle pasture, it's like, well, guess what's going to happen? It's going to get converted to cattle pasture. You know, that's sort of the market failure that I was talking about before. I mean, the good news in all this, right, is like, you know, I'm sitting here like mildly addicted to Diet Coke. Like this is actually like a great example. There's 11% the aluminum in this can that there was in the 70s. Because like when I drink this Diet Coke, I don't care about how much aluminum there is in the can. I care about, you know, the delicious taste of filling up with nothingness inside, right? And so a lot of this stuff will take care of itself if we provide the mechanisms to send appropriate price signals. It's like, well, if people that don't own the property have, you know, put some great conservation value on the property, but their only lever to like pay for a different conservation outcome is to buy the land itself, then that's not a super scalable thing. I mean, this is sort of what the Nature Conservancy does here in the US, right? Like when the Nature Conservancy wants to conserve land, they can't make payments to the landowner that already owns the land. They have to buy the land. And so to decouple land management from land ownership and to be able to send price signals for all of these different types of values that we have on the landscape, you know, I think that's going to really transform how, what the landscape looks like. It would have to. I mean, that's how economics works. There's nothing unique about forests, right? Forests are subject to the same laws of supply and demand that everybody else is. So yeah, let's start paying for what we want, and it'll change the landscape that we get.
If I could just add one more comment. Oh, sorry.
Go for it.
Just, I know that I mentioned exclusively economics before, but, and that's definitely true in places where humans have got, but in Brazil, in particular, and Indonesia, it was actually political processes that brought people into the forest and brought them into the market. So, you know, these were political moves to move people without land into the forest, build roads, and bring these into the market system, which has brought economics as the key factor there.
Yep. Yeah. Well, there's, you know, in the developing world in particular, I mean, this is why we're so focused on the US is like, you know, because there's secure land tenure. And so it's like the thing that always makes me smile, but also be sad on the inside is like some of these like really long-term afforestation projects in places with like unstable land tenure. It's, you know, I mean, this is why forestry is so hard. And, you know, why I'm so excited, because I think there's such an opportunity to do better. But it's, yeah, when you start dealing with decades and policy decisions and economics, you know, these become very, very difficult calculations to make, which is why I tend to be very skeptical of a lot of these like really long-term economic planning moves. Because, you know, 10 years ago was a very different time for all of us on this call, to say nothing of 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. You know, that's the time scale you operate on in forestry.
I'd like to give this question a shot from the lens of a smallholder farmer in the tropics. And I mentioned I have experience in Indonesia and Uganda. And I think one component of the issue is also that people on the ground don't have the knowledge on their alternatives. Like where I worked in Indonesia, in Borneo, which is a huge island, people chop down the forest because they want to make money, and they don't really have alternatives. They do some gold mining, they do some fishing in polluted rivers. They could go to the city and move away from the land, but except from that, there are no good opportunities. The same in Uganda, where you just need trees for your energy, for your cooking. And they don't really know what else to do. And a lot of the people to whom I talked, they didn't know about agroforestry. So they were like, really, you can plant trees on the same land where you're also growing your crops? So it's about communicating that knowledge, and then also generating these decentral markets in places where currently there are no markets from crops that are grown in sustainably managed land systems, like in agricultural farms, in agroforestry farms. Yeah, so it's about bringing the markets to these areas and then teaching locals. It's about capacity building and education, how these systems work.
Fascinating. Talking from deforestation now to afforestation, which I know Simeon and also Max, you've been like working in this field too. How do you make sure that afforestation actually has a positive impact? I mean, we've discussed this in your previous presentation, Max and Simeon, that there's a time value to the tree, but depending on the implementation, trees, I mean, can be planted in such a way that they actually don't survive, or that these projects can take really take away land or even like resources, right? So how do you make sure that it's doing more good than bad?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenging thing. So my co-founder, Zach Paraso, who's actually at Yale, same time as Tom Crowther was, he started this whole project because he was working with communities in Armenia, which is about the size of Maryland here in the U.S., working on a bunch of afforestation projects, planting these barren hillsides with saplings. And yeah, I mean, it's tough. The rats are eating your little seedlings that you're trying to plant, and then like to avoid the rats eating them, people are dipping them in diesel oil and then wondering why you have like hillsides full of like dead sapling. And it's really, really tough when the rubber hits the road. Even doing it in the U.S. And there's lots of very high profile planting projects that end with like 90% mortality. And I mean, it's really the intent is good. And the end result is not always guaranteed. And the tricky thing too is, especially in places that don't have secure land tenure, and making sure that the people that are doing the actions are the ones that are getting the benefit, it becomes very messy and is tough, because planting a tree is a decades long commitment. And there are few things in life that people are willing to sign decades long contracts for. It's like, if you think about your own life, mortgages, maybe, but it's, these are longer term commitment than mortgages. And so it just makes the economics very tough, and it makes it very capital intensive.
Yeah. And I'd like to add that, like, we in our lab, we push really strongly towards ecological restoration. But if like anyone would ever ask me what ecological restoration is, I don't know if I would have the answer to that question. But we're currently developing a set of principles that define some basic guidelines how to do ecological restoration, to do it right. And these involve rules like how to treat local communities and only implement projects with free and prior informed consent with local people. But then also on the land side, that you only plant tree species that are native to the area, or if you have to plant exotic species, that you really make sure that they're not invasive and that they don't have negative impacts on the land. Just as an example, there was a huge tree planting project in Canada where the goal was to maximize carbon sequestration. And a lot of trees have been planted on a peat bog. And this actually drained the area of its water content and made it so susceptible to fire that everything burned again. And they actually emitted the same amount that they wanted to sequester. Now I think I lost my connection.
You're still there.
I'm back. Yeah,
You're
cool.
still there.
So again, it's about knowledge about these principles, because you cannot apply the same set of principles for every condition. So it's like, try to limit your use of chemical herbicides, try to plant the native tree species, try to do best. But in order to know what is best, you have to have this ecological know-how. And we realized there is this huge gap, and therefore we decided to build this platform.
So one more question, and then we give it to the audience. And this question is for all the panelists. So there's definitely a significant benefit of being able to monitor forests, but forests are also properties of people, and often it's a very personal property. What are your feelings and thoughts about the trade-off between this ability of being able to real-time monitor forest and also seedlings, but also the privacy of the landowner?
Maybe I'll start.
Sure.
It's a great question, and I think we need to take ethical considerations very seriously, right? As much as we can improve the monitoring capacity, and as much as satellite imagery improves and we can really drill down to the ground. I mean, we were looking at a proprietor actually satellite monitoring company that has less than 1 meter of resolution. So it's really minute, and they track it daily. So that kind of information, I think there needs to be strong protocols on what to do with that. In our group, we talk a lot about what would happen if we bring in all of the indirect suppliers, right? Like what would happen if we do bring in everybody who might not have the current capacity to comply with these policies. Right now, they're under the radar. And so of course, for forest protection, this is suboptimal. But of course, they have their reasons. And oftentimes they have been doing that quite strategically for a number of reasons, including that they just don't, like they know that they wouldn't be able to operate in accordance with all of these practices, like they would lose their livelihoods. And so I think as much as we improve the monitoring capacity, one is that we think about how to respond to issues that we see in a compassionate and also in a way that understands that many times compliance issues are not because of unwillingness to comply, but because of a non-capacity to comply. And so therefore, if we find issues on the ground, the response should not be to pull out, but to lean in and engage. And I think, especially in the palm oil sector, the companies that have been having the most promising results have been such that do not leave their suppliers hanging and that recognize the limitations of them. And then secondly, I do also have a strong, I feel very strongly about the fact that there's a lot of monitoring going on that is now proprietary and that companies own the data and these companies have specific goals with that. And so having some sort of protocol and possibly some sort of like more global thoughts about what is the ethical way to deal with finer and finer grained monitoring data is definitely something that should be on the agenda.
Yeah, and I know from speaking to farmers in Brazil that in my experience that they haven't been so worried about being monitoring, or at least that's what they said to me, but they are very, very concerned about the errors in these monitoring devices. So time and time again, a farmer will tell me, I got blocked from selling because there was a cloud and there was a satellite error and it came up with a deforestation alert that I didn't do. And just like Janina is saying, there's an equity element to this. The big farmers that can hire a GIS expert to work out that this wasn't them and they can take that to the company, they can continue to sell. But if you're a small producer who can really only just access these supply chains, if someone tells you that you've deforested, you don't really have any recourse. And that really gets into these dimensions where you're being monitored, but you have no agency to participate in your own much more detailed knowledge of what happens on the ground.
Yeah, I think the funny part of this question is somehow that we worry about data sovereignty. But when you'd ask a smallholder in the tropics, or maybe even the average American person, they don't even know what data privacy is. The Indonesians are world record holders in the use of social media, and they don't really mind what data they're sharing and who is using it and for what. And now we're talking about, I know, data that is maybe even more private than that. I mean, a tree could be something like your piggy bank. It's what you have on your account. And I'm convinced that this data should belong to the ones that own these resources, and they should have the right to choose with whom to share it and with whom not to. But even we as a research institution, as a research group, we're developing now methods or algorithms to kind of blur that data, so that even when we use it for our publications, no one will ever be able to trace the data back to the ground. But it always depends on what we agree on with the data holder.
Yeah. So when you drive down the highway and you see the leaves changing color, as you drive through New England, you don't like go like this and be like, I'm not going to look. I don't own that land. You know, I mean, forests are just, they're part of the landscape, you know, and it's something that, you know, they provide immense value as, you know, the natural beauty of forest. I mean, there's an entire sub-discipline of forestry that's all about like managing view sheds so that the views are beautiful. I mean, I think we're a long way from this idea that, you know, this acre shall only be viewable by mine own two eyes. And, you know, I mean, satellite imagery, you know, it raises questions. I think it's a matter of degree rather than of kind. And, you know, I mean, we're so far down that rabbit hole already, you know, it's going to probably vary by society as well, what, you know, sort of what your social license to operate is. And that's something that, you know, businesses and academics and all have to take into account. Yeah, I do want to take the opportunity to point out one of the more interesting forest laws in the world, I think, is Sweden's Allemansrätten, which says you can, like, any person can go on any acre of forest, basically, as long as you're not being a jerk. You know, but, you know, then that would never happen in like Texas, right? And so, you know, different societies are going to have different, you know, different social license issues around this.
Interesting. So fascinating. Thanks a lot for all your answers. So let's go over to the questions from the audience. So this first question is for Janina and for Sam, from Petra Lesnivska, and she's asking, the policies you're referring to are largely voluntary. Would it not be better to use, so like the zero deforestation commitment, would it not be better to use machine learning to support legal enforcement approaches in preventing deforestation?
It's great. I think we have two interesting, varying viewpoints on that. Do you want to go first, Sam?
Sure. So the case that I study is actually a public-private collaboration, really. So the policy is somewhat voluntary, but it's being done by the state, and it's using property shapefile data and deforestation data that is coming from the state. So this shouldn't be seen as an alternative. We're not choosing to do machine learning instead of public policy, but rather these two things are complementary, at least in Brazil, not everywhere. But when they work together, they can produce good outcomes that public policy alone has not so far succeeded.
Yeah, from the Indonesian case, and so as policy scholars, we also study how these private policies interact with public ones, whether they reinforce each other, as in the Brazil case, or whether they may actually undermine each other. And in Indonesia, there have been a number of promising policy forays, but the baseline situation is still that the state has pushed agricultural expansion, specifically palm oil development, quite heavily, and there, at least a number of ministries are still quite concerned with not allowing companies to publish their concession data, not allowing companies to actually maintain forest land and move them into sort of more protected areas. So this is a policy landscape that is always shifting, that is also multi-level. So policies at the national level may contradict policies on the local level. They're not often enforced. And so while this offers a lot of interesting insights, the consensus to date has been that it's been an ineffectual policy landscape to prevent deforestation. In many ways, as Sam was saying, historically has rather seen the Indonesian forest as a resource to be developed for its people, such that these types of private policies that we are now looking at are trying to run a countercurrent against developments that have happened, and some of the Indonesian ministries are actively trying to undermine them also by expanding the domestic market that doesn't have these types of requirements. So it's a bit of a tricky situation. Of course, we do take into account some policies that may have helped, and we account for those also in our analysis because we want to, as best possible, identify the additional effect of the private policies. But it's always within quite a mix of strategies.
Yeah, so there actually is a regulatory requirement in California, at least through the California Air Resources Board. There's lots of structural issues with that policy and the adverse selection that happens and all that. But you know, the intent of the policy is there, and then CORSIA through the EU for carbon neutrality of flights into and out of EU, that will also be regulatory. They're still developing which protocols are actually going to be acceptable for all that. You know, and in my view, the appropriate scope of policy is to define, you know, what the overall goal is. I think what the critical thing though is that when it gets down to the individual acre and individual landowners, there needs to be flexibility in this policy to, you know, allow market mechanisms to do their thing. And, you know, the goal of policymakers is to say, you know, listen, we need to get carbon out of the atmosphere. And then like how that actually happens in practice and how those dollars are allocated to specific individual acres, you know, there are some things that may make sense to do from a central planning perspective. Management of 600 million acres of forest in the United States is not one of them. And, you know, I think there's appropriate balance that needs to be struck when we're dealing with these complex, always evolving natural systems that, yeah, I mean, they're complicated, and they're, in the US at least, lots of that land is privately owned. And, you know, there are certain lines with private property that, you know, are going to be very difficult to cross in the United States context in particular. And so a market mechanism that, that pays people to manage forest management differently is going to be far more effective and far more likely to create an immediate large scale impact than some other alternatives.
Thanks a lot. Many of our audience members, specifically Kevin Meyer and Jacqueline Levy, have been asking about the approach of the methodology Max you're using for detecting biomass and also for generating the data sets you displayed in your presentation. So could you go more into it? What kind of algorithms are you using? What kind of satellite data is that? And how would you estimate values such as biomass and tree species?
Sure. So sort of full disclosure here at the beginning is I am by far the least educated member of our team here at SilviaTerra. I'm the troll under the bridge that cranks the handle and just scales things up. You know, we have a team of forest biometricians where all they do all day is forest statistics and some of this remote sensing modeling stuff. So when we started, we were very poor. You know, we were working in a basement lab at the Yale School of Forestry on, you know, basically no budget. And we thought at the time, we were like, man, if only we could have LiDAR data, maybe this would tell us everything. You know, we couldn't afford LiDAR data. We were poor. You know, and that actually turned out to be a blessing in disguise, because like when you're talking about measuring every acre every year, you know, you can't rely on just LiDAR when you're trying to do entire countries or the whole world all the time. And so we were forced to rely on a bunch of freely available satellite imagery. You know, and this is actually one of the things that has really changed in the last decade is the explosion of publicly available free remote sensing data sets. And that's been a huge asset for our business. Now that the tricky part is to get creative and say like, well, listen, like in this satellite imagery, you're not seeing individual trees. You know, you're just seeing these like sort of blobby shades of green, you know, 15 to 30 meter resolution, you know, and you're pairing that up with field measurements and you're trying to say like, okay, well, how can we say anything useful about this? And our overall philosophy has been very different than I think a lot of the approaches that people have taken over the history of remote sensing of forest imagery with this, you know, there's often been this idea that there's like a silver bullet, like if only I can get hyperspectral, that'll tell me all the answers I need, or if only I can get high resolution LiDAR, or increase the point density, that'll like, you know, like the LiDAR fairy is like one of my least favorite things. People are like, well, as a human, you can see the trees. I'm like, listen, like if you can solve that problem, you'd be making a lot more money over at the Google self-driving cars guys. Like this stuff is really, really hard, especially when you get into like complex forests where you have occlusions and all that stuff. So anyway, yeah, we started off just trying to do the best job we could with really coarse satellite imagery. And the key though is to combine imagery from different sensors, imagery from different times to try to pull out the underlying signal of forest structuring composition. You know, so we'll use things like time series of Landsat, we use things like elevation, slope, and aspect, we'll use things like radar, you know, we'll use things like, you know, basically we're data greedy. anything that is correlated to the underlying structure of the forest, you should be able to use to pull out some information. The trick, though, is to do so in a way that is statistically robust and rigorous and doesn't involve systematic errors across your whole property. But I mean, there's a whole field of forest biometrics that is all about this question of how do you measure forests in a way that you can take to the bank and use for financial transactions. There's a 100-year-old history of industrial forestry in this country. And so that might not be as technical maybe as some people were hoping. I'd be happy to take this conversation offline or connect you with some of our forest biometricians who will actually be able to give you the real answers that you want. But that's sort of the high level summary.
I think it's a really interesting point, and it connects to the fact that working in this space requires you to work with different data modalities, which is, for example, in the policy space, there will be like surveying people using satellite data and using also like infrastructure data, forestry management, as you said, different kinds of satellite sensors, and also, like Simeon said, mobile data, phone data used to connect that. So I think there's a common theme in this, and it will be an interesting question for everyone. It's like, what are your best, like what are like good approaches on like combining those different modalities? What are like, what is difficult? What do you think machine learning can provide on like providing more insights, having so many challenging different modalities? Maybe Simeon?
Yeah. So yeah, the core of our method is actually the combination of satellite imagery and ground data. With the big shortcoming so far that we have global satellite coverage, but the ground data that we have been relying on so far has only been collected in the places where people actually go down and collect data and where they have the funding to do so, which is basically in Europe and North America. And therefore we have huge dark spots basically all over the tropics where we have the largest tree restoration potential because we have the largest forests there. So that's why we're setting on this quest to see what better ground data we can actually get, and figured this mechanism to hand out a smartphone app to as many users as possible, and try to break the technology down to make it, the technological barrier as low as possible. So this should work on basically any smartphone that's out there that can take a photo. And I mentioned earlier that we're using a credit card sized card, so could be a gym membership card or whatever, as a reference object in these photos to get the tree data. Of course, you could make that more complex by using depth sensors or so, but again, these are not available on all of the smartphones that are out there. And then at the same time, you have to think about how to incentivize the collection of this data. But, and you could take photos, you could use drones, both drones that fly over the fields, but also drones that fly through your forests and collect data in that way. But those are hopefully maybe unnecessary steps of complicating things. And yeah, our ambition is really to make that as simple, as easy as possible to get in that ground data.
Janina and Sam, how do you include the survey data, which is such a different way of data modality, into your satellite imagery?
So with the...
I think you're muted.
Am I still muted? I thought I unmuted.
You're fine. Go for it.
Okay, great.
No, now it works.
Okay, so with the satellite data, first what we did is we used that supply chain data that I demonstrated to identify properties that were linked to these cattle supply chains. And then we randomly sampled these properties, stratifying by large and also by medium and small, for the reasons that Janina has already talked about. They're more likely to be indirect, they're more likely to face inequities from these policies. And so that means that we already have a clear link between the supply chain data, and before we actually did the sample, we also linked them to the property level data we had. So we can see their deforestation, we know who they sell to, and then we asked them all the questions that we couldn't get from a satellite, we couldn't get from this cattle movement data. So we asked them about their production system, we asked them about their opinions, how they feel about their life, how they feel about their neighbors. We asked them their perceptions on fire, on their use of fire, and all these kind of things that really add a huge amount of complexity, but satellites can't do. So the integration there, because it was built in at the beginning, is quite easy. And yeah, it's definitely much more of a problem when you have to do it at the end.
So Ed Cooper is asking about biodiversity and the role biodiversity plays in your work. Recently, there have been a lot of discussions ongoing on biodiversity banks, obviously also parts of a policy that protects biodiversity. And this is, I think, more like a technical, actually intersection question, which is saying like, if biodiversity is like, what role does biodiversity play currently in your work? And if it plays a role, how would you try to detect this and measure this using methods computationally as well as survey participation?
Yeah, maybe I can jump in there real quick. The measurement is the key question in all of this, right? Like, so in forests, actually, it turns out that most of the carbon is stored below ground, right? But nobody gets paid for below ground carbon because that is impossible to measure, in any sort of cost-effective way. And so the real question for these biodiversity models is, if you're trying to like infrared, individual pumas somewhere, like that is going to be a very difficult technical challenge. What you can measure is the habitat of these animals, and we haven't gotten anything totally up and running for that yet. But in theory, you could imagine, using a lot of these environmental attributes like tree species and composition and structure and all these types of things to design habitat suitability indices, which is an established area of research, and maybe trading off of that. I think trying to do individual animal detection and tracking over time, that's going to be a tough one. So I know that's my take.
From our perspective, it's a great question. I mean, it'd be interesting to again throw it back to the machine learning community. In the policies that we study, many times not all forest needs to be protected, but rather there's specific categories of forest that include both what they call high conservation value forest, which includes high biodiversity values, but also forests that are culturally important, that are important for livelihoods. And many of these assessments, they tend to be done on the ground, and they can only, so far, be done through local environmental and social impact assessors, basically, that go to the ground and figure out what the particular function of those forest patches are. Now there's a new idea to expand the definition basically to also include what is called high carbon stock forest, where they include any forest that is above, I think that stores above 35 tons. Now I'll have to think about the measurements, but I can get back to you on that. But there's a specific notion of how much carbon the forest needs to store to be considered a forest and not just shrubland. And so I think in that perspective, that could be easier to be included in the type of protection assessments from above, right, to see whether the forest that was deforested was actually allowed or not to be deforested. But with the biodiversity, as David mentioned, it's kind of a hard battle to move away from sort of on the ground understandings and assessments, in my mind at least.
From the CrowdLab perspective, one of the biggest use cases from our data is actually to identify where to prioritize your restoration intervention. And we're applying criteria such as potential forest cover in a spot or potential carbon sequestration, both above and below ground. And unfortunately, I can't talk about all of the details because that's confidential, but we are also working on potential biodiversity layers so that you could figure out for your plot in question what would be the potential tree species biodiversity there. And should I rather work on this plot or on that plot? And do I want to have the bigger carbon impact or the bigger biodiversity impact? And another role that biodiversity plays in our work is currently a lot of the restoration planning, reforestation planning is centered around community work and economic aspects of restoration. And I explained earlier, and Max explained earlier, and I mean, that's the gist of this talk, that those factors are more important than actually the ecological factors. But on the other hand, not many are actually looking on where restoration should happen from the ecological perspective, and what's the best place for example, connecting habitats or connecting forest remnants and enabling animals and plants to migrate between these spots. And we'll be able to indicate where this is possible and like incorporate factors such as road constructions or this things, but also looking at how the soil communities look like, how carbon is distributed over the landscape. And this is in the pipeline.
From my perspective, I know that the land change science community, such as myself, has been criticized by ecologists for not having a good enough definition of biodiversity. We, except for these high conservation value landscapes, often we just think about forest means biodiversity, more forests, better. And obviously, the more trees that are around, the more biodiversity there is. But there's a lot of evidence coming out now around overhunting. And there's this concept of empty forests, which are completely functionally standing, but missing the large animals that have hugely important roles to play in ecosystem function that are missed by our metrics. And this is a criticism that I think is completely accurate, but in terms of the scale that we're working on, it's difficult to integrate better strategies right now.
Two more questions before we wrap it up. So the very common question was, especially to Max and Simeon, if the dashboard, Simeon, you presented is open source and the tools you showed from the Crowder Lab or planning to make available for public, and the same question also for Max, if the data which your company collected over, if there are any plans to open source this data set for the wider research community.
Yeah, it's short answer, yes. It's definitely our principle to make that data as open and as freely available as possible. We are focusing on standardized solutions that apply for everybody and also automized solutions. And those will be available freely. We are, of course, also thinking about sustainable business models around that aspect and more targeted or specific analysis, like imagine you collect ground data from a certain area and you use this ground data to get better spatial resolutions or higher accuracies for your area of interest, and that might be a service that we want to offer as a paid service at some point. But so far, we try to keep it as open and as free as possible.
Yep. So short answer on our end is no, but if you're an academic, yeah, potentially. And then, yeah, that actually is a service that we offer. So if, anyway, so, you know, there's lots of interesting business models. I mean, the high level view though on a lot of this is that data about forests is okay, but it's actually not that great of a business. What's really valuable about these forests is the underlying asset. And what's exciting is the ability to use data to change how that asset is valued and how it is managed. And that's, I think, the real prize in this whole field. that's something that we're working on very closely here in the United States. And I mean, there's no reason why it can't eventually be applied across the globe. But it's they're outside of the U.S. Like Simeon said, there's lots of issues with data availability, and there's also land tenure issues and other economic issues that come into play. So yeah, I mean it's tough, but I mean that's why we're all fairly young on this call, because we have decades left of work to do. So yeah.
Which brings me to my last question, a great point. Given for the future generations and also for the people who would like to join from the machine learning side, especially the work you guys have been doing for already many years, what specific classes or methods or innovations you think the machine learning community especially should be working on with forests in mind? So maybe we can go through, and Janina, would you like to answer that question?
Sure, yeah. From our side, as I think we did identify a number of challenges that we would like to throw back to the machine learning community. Again, one thing that I'm quite interested in is the ability of machine learning to identify specific objects, right? And then identify particular patches or patterns that could then be linked back to classes of land use. So the example that I was showing, where if we were able to quite quickly identify from imagery what probable type of farmer, what probable type of crop, what size these types of plots are, that we could classify them, that would be a huge help to understand where the current deforestation frontier is, especially as, at least in the case of Indonesia, what we know so far is that it appears that deforestation from large concessions have decreased in the past. But again, this is based on sample data that is not complete. And it appears that deforestation by small tortoises might increase, but nobody has great data on that yet, other than sort of on the ground anecdotal data. So anything that could help us to understand this better would allow us to identify and treat the causes of deforestation in a more systematic way.
Yeah, and in Brazil, as I'm sure everyone knows, the topic that's really been hot is fire. So last summer, there were huge fires in all the newspapers. Governments got involved, the French president got involved, and where machine learning could come into that, in the same way that Janina was talking about with patches, is that it's differentiating types of fire, so accidental fire from intentional fire, and where those fires originate. And the fire data available is really high resolution with long time series. So classifying types of fire based on the spread, based on the pattern, would be hugely valuable for Brazil.
Simeon, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, one of the questions that I hear most often from the practitioners out there on the ground is, how do I best manage my land in these uncertain times? And I find these times very uncertain myself. I'm currently in Germany and we're in a big drought at the moment. It's not raining, and this is catastrophic. And tree species are gonna die out here in these lowlands. Partly it's tree species that don't belong here, but forestry depends on these. And things are worse in other places around the world with fires, with droughts, with natural catastrophes. So how do I choose species when I don't know what the weather is gonna be like this year or next year? And if you look at the IPCC climate predictions, they differ also quite a lot. So what's the data that you can actually rely on, and how do you plan in these risky and uncertain times? That's, I think, one of the biggest questions that I get asked, and that I would pass on to the AI ML community.
Yeah. So on my end, I'm a big, I'm a cynic. So I always want to, follow the money, and understand how the money flows. And one of the biggest things that's preventing money from flowing is the availability of metrics that are robust enough to be traded upon. This is less of a problem in things like timber. It's becoming less of a problem in things like carbon. It remains an enormous problem in things like wildlife habitat, wildfire risk, water quality, all these other ecosystem services that we all know are valuable. And up until now, we have not possessed ways to, at scale and cost effectively, measure and monitor these things. To me, that's a big frontier, and that's a place where effort that we invest is going to have a vastly disproportionate effect on what the landscape looks like. Once we're able to measure and trade on these things, like a great way to get more of what you want is to pay for what you want. So let's give people confidence that they're getting what they pay for, and we'll get a different looking landscape. So that's I think one of the biggest levers that the machine learning and AI community has.
Thank you so much for all your time. It was such a wonderful talk, and I really enjoyed the whole panel discussion. And I'm sure that the audience learned a lot from this past hour and also from the talks previously. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for all the information you provided to us in the audience. And unfortunately, you can't hear the clapping, but I'm sure this is right now happening a lot. So before we close,
yeah, just to say that.
Oh yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Just to say that it'd be great to get in touch, like after this session as well. So if anybody wants to reach out via email or just look us up on the website, it'd be great to continue these discussions.
I think if you write your email address in the chat, the panel, the audience members who are here, they can definitely save it in. So before we really finish it up, I give the last word to David Warnick, who's having the closing session.
Thank you so much again to everyone and to David for leading that fantastic panel discussion. I just want to say a few closing remarks. So stick around for 2 minutes, and hopefully you'll be able to see my screen in a moment. Oops. There. Can you see? Excellent. So I just wanted to say that this is, again, the third day of a 5-day workshop. We've gotten through 3 days thus far. Main workshop day on Sunday, then energy day yesterday, and now we've had a wonderful day on land use, agriculture, and forestry. Tomorrow is also really exciting. It will be about climate science and adaptation. That will involve things like incorporating machine learning simulations into climate models and climate forecasting, as well as machine learning applications in climate change adaptation. So I'm really excited for that. There is a link that you should be able to see to join that separate Zoom meeting tomorrow. Then finally on Thursday, there will be Cross-Cutting Methods Day. And so in particular, for those of you today who are really excited about remote sensing, this could be an opportunity to find out even more about remote sensing. We have a whole session on it within that day. We also have accelerated experimentation, machine learning for accelerating the process of scientific experimentation, and then incorporating physical constraints into machine learning models to use what domain knowledge we have. So there is a link there for Methods Day, again, on Thursday. So all of this would not be possible, again, without a huge organizing team, co-organizers, and a program committee. So just so much thanks to absolutely everybody putting this whole major project together. And the workshop, Tackling Climate Change with Machine Learning, is part of the initiatives run by Climate Change AI, which is a group that seeks to facilitate work at the intersection of climate change and machine learning to really drive forward innovation at this intersection and to build the kinds of interdisciplinary teams that are necessary to make progress in this space. So in addition to having physical events, so we had a number of other workshops. You can see all the recordings on this website. We also wrote a 100-page survey paper of all the ways that we think that machine learning can be applied with high impact to climate change. You can read that paper, including interactive summaries of it if you find 100 pages and 700 references to be a little bit hard to wade through. We also have summaries of lots of useful resources and data sets that you can play around with if you are into that kind of thing. And we have also a forum where you can join discussions digitally, perhaps continuing on from this workshop with other people who are interested in these kinds of areas, find jobs, discuss opportunities, and just generally bounce ideas back and forth digitally. You can also sign up for our newsletter, which comes out about once a month. There are in the newsletter, there are calls for submissions to different kinds of events like workshops. There are funding opportunities. There are projects and courses that you can become involved with, interesting readings, and also job opportunities. So I highly encourage everybody to consider signing up for the Climate Change AI newsletter. And with that, I would like to thank everyone again for joining for all of today. And for those of you, especially who have been around for several days of this workshop, I hope that you can join us for another couple of days more at Climate Science and Adaptation Day and also at Methods Day. And with that, I'll let everybody go have some offline discussion. Look forward to seeing what happens as a result of these conversations. And thank you again to our wonderful speakers.